I was sitting on the edge of the bed when I heard the living room door slam. It wasn't late, but the sun had already disappeared, and the house fell silent in a way that hurt. My card was no longer in the drawer where I always kept it. Neither was my retirement receipt. In that instant, for the first time, I thought that maybe this wasn't just discomfort or ingratitude on my part. Maybe it was something wrong. Very wrong. But to understand how I got to this point, I need to go back a little in time, to when I still believed that trusting family was the safest thing there was. If you follow real stories like this one, subscribe to the channel now. Now let me tell you how it all started. For most of my life, I was an independent man. I worked from a young age, had 2 marriages, took care of my house, my bills, my decisions. I never liked depending on anyone. I would wake up early, handle everything myself, go shopping, pay bills, clean the house. It wasn't excessive pride. It was just the way I learned to live. Even when age started to weigh on me, I still felt capable, until my body decided to contradict me. After a severe respiratory infection, followed by another even worse one, I spent weeks hospitalized. They were long, confusing days with machines beeping, lights that never turned off, and a constant feeling that something in me had changed forever. When I was discharged, the doctors were clear. I could no longer be alone. There were dizzy spells, weakness in one leg, risk of falling. That hit me harder than any diagnosis. For the first time, I had to accept help. That's how I came to live with family members. At first, it seemed like just a difficult adjustment. I felt out of place, as if I was occupying a space that wasn't mine. Conversations changed in tone. What had been care began to sound like control. "Let me do it. That's too complicated for you. It's better if we handle it." I swallowed hard and accepted. After all, they were helping me, or at least that's what I told myself. Over time, small concessions began. They asked for my card to withdraw my retirement money, claiming it would be more practical. Then they asked for the PIN, saying it was just for security. I hesitated but gave in. I didn't want to seem distrustful. I didn't want to be the difficult old man. Each time I handed something over, I felt a tightness in my chest, a shame I couldn't explain. Still, I thought it was normal. Family does this, I thought. Purchases started appearing on the statements, things I didn't recognize, amounts larger than usual. When I asked, there was always a quick, almost rehearsed answer. "It was food. It was medicine. We'll look at it later." Gradually, I stopped asking. The silence seemed less painful than the feeling of being a burden. I felt bad, but I couldn't name what it was. It didn't seem like violence. Violence, in my mind, was shouting, shoving, visible aggression. What I was living through was subtle, almost invisible. Beyond the money, there was the way things were. Decisions no longer went through me. My schedule, my appointments, even my clothes. When I tried to give my opinion, came the impatient look, the loud sigh, the cutting comment. I started speaking less, withdrawing more. I spent most of my time sitting, observing the house that wasn't mine, trying not to be a bother. The dependence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and that broke me inside. There were days when food was late, others when medication came at the wrong time. I told myself it was distraction, rushing around, fatigue. I never thought of neglect. The words seemed too heavy to fit my reality. I justified everything. They work a lot, they have problems, I don't want to cause confusion. That was the speech I repeated in my head, as if it were a shield against the truth. Until one day, people from outside entered the house. Professionals who didn't know me, who had no emotional ties to me. They looked, asked questions, observed. Things I had already normalized caught their attention. The lack of autonomy, the use of my money, my emotional state. For the first time, someone said out loud that this wasn't right. I remained silent. Part of me wanted to disagree. Another part felt a strange relief, almost a guilt for feeling relieved. When they told me I could go to a place where I would receive adequate care, I cried. Not from sadness, from exhaustion. Exhaustion from pretending everything was fine, from carrying guilt for something I hadn't caused. Leaving that house wasn't an escape, it was a rescue. But in that moment, I still didn't fully understand that. I only knew that something had broken for good. On the way to the shelter, I looked out the window and thought about my life before all of this. I thought about who I was, who I had become, and how easy it is for an elderly person to lose control of their own story without realizing it. I didn't know it was violence. I only knew I was disappearing little by little. And it was there, on that silent journey, that I began to understand that my story needed to be told, not out of revenge, but so that others don't confuse abuse with care, as I confused it for so long. Even after arriving at the shelter, it took me days to understand that I wasn't being punished or discarded. The idea of leaving the family's house made me feel like I had failed at something essential. I wondered in silence where I had gone wrong, at what moment I stopped being someone trustworthy to become someone who needed to be managed. The guilt still accompanied me, stuck to my skin, even when everyone around me treated me with respect. There, for the first time in a long time, someone asked me what I wanted to eat, what time I preferred to bathe, if I was comfortable. They were simple, almost banal gestures, but they dismantled me inside. I realized how much I had gotten used to not choosing, not giving opinions, not fully existing. The violence I hadn't known how to name had taught me to diminish myself, and undoing that seemed harder than accepting help. At night, lying in a bed that wasn't mine, but also wasn't hostile, I began to review every concession I made, thinking it was love, every silence I swallowed, thinking it was respect. For the first time, I considered the possibility that trusting too much can also hurt. And that aging shouldn't mean losing your own voice. This awareness was still fragile, but it was already being born, and it would change everything from then on. In the first days in that new place, I observed everything in silence. The sound of wheelchair wheels in the hallway, the low voices of other elderly people, the constant smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was a simple but organized environment, and that confused me. Part of me still expected someone to say I was there by mistake, that my family would come get me, that it had all been a misunderstanding. Another part, more tired, just wanted to rest without fear of bothering anyone. Gradually, I began to notice details that before seemed too small to matter. No one rushed me. No one made decisions for me without explaining. When I asked a question, I received a direct answer, without irony, without impatience. That made me uncomfortable. I wasn't used to being treated like that. The normalcy of that care exposed how much the other environment had been distorted, even though I still resisted accepting that completely. During a conversation with one of the professionals, she asked me how my retirement worked before I got sick. I spoke naturally that I always took care of everything myself. When I told her I had handed over the card and PIN to family members, I noticed her expression change, almost imperceptibly. She didn't interrupt me, didn't accuse me, just asked me to continue. It was in that safe space that I began to speak more than I planned. The words came out slowly but loaded. I told her about the strange purchases, the lack of money at the end of the month, the constant feeling of owing something, even without knowing what. I told her I felt guilty for questioning, as if asking for an explanation was a betrayal. As I spoke, I noticed something new. No one there tried to justify what I was describing. No one said, "They do this because they love you." The attentive silence was more revealing than any answer. She explained to me, carefully, that abuse doesn't always come with physical aggression, that violence can be silent, gradual, disguised as care, that many elderly people go through this without realizing it, precisely because they trust. That hit me like a slow shock. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a bitter realization which fit into every memory I had tried to minimize. In the following days, I began to remember situations that I had previously pushed into a corner of my memory. The times when I heard comments about the cost of keeping me, the exchanged looks when I entered the room, the decisions made without me being consulted. None of this had happened all at once. It was gradual, like constant erosion. And maybe that's why it was so hard to notice. By the time I realized it, I no longer recognized my own limits. There was also the neglect, which I always hesitated to admit. Medication times ignored, appointments postponed, irregular meals. I justified everything as carelessness. But there, with attentive professionals, I understood that care shouldn't depend on anyone's mood. That repeatedly forgetting isn't the same as making a mistake once. This understanding hurt more than I expected because it forced me to accept that I had been left aside. The hardest thing, however, was dealing with the idea that this came from people close to me, not from strangers, not from someone I could easily point to as a villain. They were old ties, mixed with good memories, with shared stories. Recognizing the violence didn't erase the affection of the past, but it made it impossible to ignore the present. This ambiguity left me confused, divided between nostalgia and the need to protect myself. There was a quick visit after I was already at the shelter. Few words, little exchange, an evident discomfort in the air. No apology, no explanation. That was more clarifying than any discussion. I realized that if I went back, nothing would change. The subsequent absence confirmed this. The distance settled in without confrontation, as if my departure had been a relief for everyone, except me. As the weeks passed, I began to participate in activities. Physical therapy, group conversations, small assisted walks. My body still had limitations, but my mind began to clear. I was beginning to feel something I had lost: autonomy. Small daily choices took on enormous weight. Choosing clothes, deciding rest time, giving an opinion about something simple. It was like recovering pieces of myself. Even so, the guilt didn't disappear immediately. At night, I still wondered if I could have acted differently, if I should have set boundaries earlier. It took me a while to understand that responsibility isn't the same as guilt, that trusting isn't a mistake, that violence only sustains itself when it finds silence, and my silence wasn't consent, it was ignorance. Gradually, I began to accept that my story wasn't isolated. Others there had similar trajectories, although different in details. The pattern was the same: loss of autonomy, disguised exploitation, emotional isolation. This gave me a strange sense of belonging, mixed with indignation. How many would still be living this without knowing? How many would still feel bad, without understanding why? It was at this point that I realized my story wasn't just about me. It spoke of something bigger, more silent, and more common than one might imagine. I still didn't know what the consequences of all this would be, or how my relationship with family would continue. But one thing became clear: I wasn't weak for having been hurt. I had been vulnerable at a critical moment, and that was used against me. This awareness didn't bring immediate peace, but it brought lucidity, and with it, the certainty that what I lived through needed to be named. Not to accuse, but to warn. Because as long as violence continues to be confused with care, many others will disappear little by little, as I almost disappeared. As time went on, I began to realize that the hardest part of that experience wasn't relearning to walk safely or accepting help with simple tasks. The hardest part was rebuilding trust in myself. I had spent months believing that the discomfort I felt was a sign of weakness, when in fact it was an alert. Each memory now came back with a different weight, a different interpretation, as if my own story was being rewritten inside my head. There was a specific afternoon when this became clear. I was sitting in the common room, observing the movement, when I heard another elderly person tell that his grandson took care of his finances. The way he spoke, with the same justifications I used, caused me immediate distress. It was like hearing my own voice from months ago. In that instant, I understood that what had happened to me followed a silent pattern, repeated in different houses with different families. The conversations with the professionals became deeper. They didn't pressure me, but asked questions that helped me organize my thoughts. We talked about boundaries, about autonomy, about how physical dependence is often used as an excuse to remove rights. Each explanation was made calmly, without technical terms, without judgment. That gave me courage to admit things I had previously hidden even from myself. I realized that while I was in the family's house, I had been reduced to a condition. I was no longer someone with history, opinions, and desires. I was the elderly person, the problem, the responsibility. This change didn't happen overnight. It was built in small gestures, in seemingly harmless words, in decisions made without consultation, and that's why it was so hard to react. I began to remember when I tried to talk about what I felt and was interrupted, when I heard that I was confused, too sensitive, ungrateful. These phrases, repeated over time, undermined my security. I began to doubt my own perception. If I felt bad, it must be in my head. If something seemed wrong, I wasn't understanding it right. Today I know that this is also violence. At the shelter, no one diminished what I said. On the contrary, each account was validated, contextualized, welcomed. This didn't erase the pain, but it gave it a legitimate place. I no longer needed to justify myself for feeling what I felt. This internal change was slow but transformative. I began to sleep better, to eat better, to speak more firmly. Physical therapy helped my body, but it was these conversations that strengthened my mind. With each small physical achievement came also an emotional achievement. Getting up without so much fear, walking a few more steps, but also saying no when something didn't please me. Exercising autonomy became part of the treatment, even in the simplest things. Still, there were moments of deep sadness. The absence of family weighed heavily, especially at night. It wasn't just missing the people, but the idea of family I had. Accepting that that expectation no longer held up was a silent mourning. A mourning without a funeral, without a clear goodbye. Just the realization that some relationships don't survive when power changes hands. Over time, I understood that going to the shelter wasn't a defeat. It was a necessary interruption. If I had remained in that situation, perhaps my emotional health would have deteriorated even more than my physical health. This perception didn't come immediately, but formed as I regained small controls over my routine and my choices. I began to observe the other residents more closely. Each one carried a different story, but many shared the same feeling of having been pushed out of their own lives. Some spoke openly, others kept everything in silence. I saw myself in them, and this reinforced the importance of recognizing the signs early, before the damage became too deep. It was during this period that I began to accept that my story didn't need to end in guilt or shame. It could serve as a warning, as an example of something that happens more frequently than one might imagine. I still didn't know how this would manifest, but I felt that naming what I lived through was the first step to not allowing it to repeat, neither with me nor with others. Gradually, the feeling of having been broken gave way to something different. I wasn't whole yet, but I was conscious. And this consciousness, although painful, gave me back dignity. I no longer confused care with control, nor love with exploitation. This clarity didn't erase the past, but prepared me to face what was still to come. The path ahead was still uncertain. There were legal, emotional, and family issues that I knew wouldn't disappear on their own. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I was supported, informed, and above all, heard. And that made all the difference. There was a moment when I realized something simple but profound. I no longer needed to ask permission to exist. At the shelter, no one sighed when I took time to respond. No one rolled their eyes when I needed help. This absence of impatience made me understand how much I had internalized the idea that my time was worth less. Recovering this basic respect was like relearning to occupy space in the world without fear. This change didn't happen in a grandiose way. It was silent, almost discreet. But every time I took a position, even on something small, I felt like I was recovering a piece of my identity. The violence I experienced hadn't left visible marks on my body, but it had shaped my behavior. Recognizing this was painful, but liberating. I was finally beginning to emerge from the shadow I had been placed in. With clarity also came a difficult phase, one that no one had prepared me to face. After recognizing the violence, the inevitable question arose: what to do with all of this now? I didn't feel explosive anger or a desire for confrontation. What existed was an uncomfortable emptiness, a space between who I thought my family was and what they had become when I was vulnerable. This space hurt more than any discussion. The professionals began to explain to me carefully what paths existed from there. It wasn't about revenge or immediate punishment, but about protection and rights. They spoke slowly, respecting my time, understanding that each piece of information needed to be absorbed without pressure. I listened attentively, but also scared. Part of me still wanted to believe that everything could be resolved with a conversation. Another part already understood that some boundaries, once crossed, don't return to place on their own. Dealing with documents was one of the hardest moments. Seeing numbers, statements, records of transactions I hadn't made was like receiving concrete proof of something I had tried to deny for months. There was no longer room for doubts or emotional justifications. What was there was objective, cold, incontestable. That took the ground from under me, but also gave me back something important, the certainty that I wasn't imagining things. At the same time, fear arose. Fear of retaliation, fear of conflicts, fear of being seen as ungrateful. This fear didn't come from nowhere. It had been built over time, fed by comments, silences, and small veiled threats. Even far away, I still carried this feeling that any movement of mine could cause problems. It took a lot of support to understand that protecting myself wasn't attacking anyone. The nights continued to be the most difficult period. During the day, I kept busy with activities, conversations, and exercises. At night, the silence brought insistent thoughts. I remembered good moments from the past, laughter, celebrations. The mind mixed everything up, as if trying to convince me I was exaggerating. It was a constant internal battle between affective memory and recent reality. There were days when I thought about giving up any course of action, about simply accepting what happened and moving forward in silence. But whenever this idea arose, the memory of how I felt before came along. Diminished, confused, guilty for existing. I didn't want to go back to that emotional place. Even without knowing exactly what the future would be like, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had lived through. Over time, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. My posture was different. My speech, firmer. I no longer apologized for things that weren't my responsibility. This internal strengthening didn't come from motivational speeches, but from daily coexistence with respect. When someone treats you as a subject for long enough, you begin to see yourself that way too. The prolonged absence of family ended up becoming an answer in itself. There was no real attempt at rapprochement, no genuine interest in knowing how I was. That hurt, but it also clarified. I stopped waiting for something that probably wouldn't come. This silent abandonment confirmed that my decision to leave had been necessary, even if painful. I began to talk more with other residents about boundaries and choices, not as someone who had answers, but as someone who had learned through pain. These exchanges showed me that sharing experiences is also a form of healing. When one story echoes in another, the individual weight decreases a little. Shame loses strength when it's illuminated. Gradually, I began to think about the future with less fear. Not a grandiose future, but a possible one. Continue treatment. Maintain my autonomy within my limitations. Live with dignity. I didn't need to recover everything I lost. I just needed not to lose more of myself. This perception was a silent but profound turning point. I still carried open emotional wounds, and I knew some wouldn't close completely, but they no longer defined who I was. The violence I experienced wouldn't be the final chapter of my story. There were still consequences, decisions, and confrontations ahead. But now I was no longer alone, nor lost within my own guilt. I was conscious, and that changed everything. There was a day when one of the professionals asked me, very carefully, if I felt safe regarding the recent past. The question seemed simple, but left me in silence for a few seconds. Safety, I realized, wasn't just being physically distant. It was no longer living with fear of losing the little I still had left. It was at that moment I understood how much violence had infiltrated my perception of the world. I also began to reflect on how isolation had been part of the process. Gradually, I distanced myself from external contacts, from longer conversations, from anyone who might notice something wrong. Not because someone had directly forbidden me, but because I had been convinced it was better that way. This realization was hard. The isolation hadn't been an accident, but a natural consequence of being made to believe I was a bother. When I thought about this, an unexpected feeling came. Indignation. Not explosive anger, but a silent, mature indignation. I didn't deserve to have been treated as a problem to be managed. I had a history, a whole life of effort, choices, and responsibilities. Recognizing this was like recovering a sense of justice that had been stifled by the fear of displeasing. This indignation didn't push me toward confrontation, but toward lucidity. I began to understand that protecting myself was a legitimate act, not a betrayal. That establishing boundaries didn't erase the past, but prevented it from continuing to hurt me in the present. This understanding brought a different calm, firmer, less fragile. I no longer needed to internally justify myself for having chosen to survive with dignity. From the moment I accepted that I needed to protect myself, everything began to gain a more concrete outline. It was no longer just about feelings or confused memories, but about practical decisions. The professionals explained to me that there were sufficient records to demonstrate that my rights had been violated. Nothing was presented as an imposition. Each step was discussed with me, respecting my pace, something I hadn't experienced for a long time. It was in this process that I understood the importance of having impartial witnesses, people who weren't emotionally involved, who analyzed the facts carefully. They observed my physical condition, my emotional state, and the way my income had been used. For the first time, my word wasn't put in doubt or relativized. It had value on its own, and that was deeply reparative. There were moments when fear tried to return. Thoughts like, "This will cause problems," or "maybe it's better to leave it alone," arose frequently. But now these thoughts didn't dominate me like before. I could recognize them as remnants of a period when I was conditioned not to react. With support, I learned that silence only protects those who benefit from it. Meanwhile, my routine continued. Physical therapy progressed, even if slowly. Each small physical progress came accompanied by emotional strengthening. I wasn't just relearning to move more safely, but also to occupy my place without apologizing. This connection between body and mind became very clear to me during that period. Conversations with other residents continued to be a mirror. Some were at different stages of consciousness, others still trapped in guilt and denial. I didn't try to convince anyone of anything. I just shared what I lived through when asked. Sometimes that was enough for someone to start questioning their own situation. I noticed how stories have power when they're real. There was also an internal process of forgiveness, but not in the common sense. It wasn't forgiveness directed at others, but at myself. I needed to forgive my own naivety, my excessive trust, my delay in noticing the signs. I understood that aging didn't make me less capable of judging. It just put me in a position of greater vulnerability at a critical moment. The definitive absence of family stopped being an open wound and became a sensitive scar. It still hurt on some days, especially when I saw others receiving visits, but I no longer interpreted this as proof that I didn't deserve care. On the contrary, I began to understand that true care doesn't abandon when it stops controlling. Over time, I began to participate more actively in decisions about my future. Where I would stay, which activities I wanted to prioritize, how to manage my resources safely. These choices, which before seemed small, now represented something much bigger. Recovered autonomy. I no longer had everything I had before, but I had something essential back, the ability to decide. The story I lived began to organize itself inside me, like a puzzle finally complete. The financial abuse, the psychological violence, the neglect, the isolation. Everything made sense now. Not to feed resentment, but to avoid repetition. The clarity didn't erase the pain, but transformed it into learning. I still knew there were final stages to face, consequences and courses of action that didn't depend only on me. But unlike before, I didn't feel small in the face of this. I had support, information, and mainly consciousness. And this consciousness was the greatest protection I could have gained after everything. I also began to notice how shame works as an invisible leash. It doesn't shout, doesn't hit, doesn't threaten directly. It just whispers that it's better not to speak, that no one will understand, that you'll seem weak. And I had lived too long obeying that whisper. At the shelter, when I spoke and no one interrupted me, I felt shame lose strength, as if it couldn't survive in a place where respect was the rule. In one of the conversations, they explained to me that many families don't always see themselves as aggressors. Some begin solving things with the justification of care, and when they realize they can control money and decisions, they cross boundaries without even admitting they crossed them. That didn't bring me comfort, but brought a bitter understanding. I wasn't just dealing with isolated acts, but with a behavior that had become normalized within that house, fed by my fragility. This made me think about how I myself, unintentionally, made things easier out of fear of conflict. I gave the card. I handed over the pin. I accepted vague answers. I pretended I believed. Not because I agreed, but because I was exhausted. Exhausted from depending, exhausted from asking, exhausted from feeling that any questioning would turn into an accusation against me. When I recognized this, I stopped blaming myself and began to understand the mechanism. It wasn't weakness. It was emotional survival. There was a day when an assistant asked me what I most feared if everything came to light. I answered without thinking. Losing the little bond that still exists. That's when she told me gently that a bond that depends on silence and fear isn't a bond, it's control. That phrase kept echoing in me for weeks, not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. And truth, even when it hurts, has a strange power to liberate. I began to imagine how many people my age are still living something similar and calling it a difficult family phase. How many are feeling bad, exactly as I felt, without knowing that this has a name? I didn't want to become a symbol of anything, but I began to accept that my experience could serve as a warning, not to destroy relationships, but to prevent vulnerability from being used as an opportunity by those who should protect. Reaching this point in my life didn't mean finding easy answers or feeling immediate relief. What happened was more discreet and deeper. Gradually, I began to realize that the greatest loss I suffered wasn't just financial or physical, but the loss of trust in myself. Recovering it required more effort than any exercise or treatment. It required facing truths I avoided for a long time. I began to revisit the past with different eyes. Situations that before seemed small now revealed a clear pattern. It wasn't an isolated mistake or a moment of passing stress. It was a sequence of decisions made by others, always justified as care, always presented as necessary, and I, weakened, accepted each one believing I had no better alternative. This perception didn't come accompanied by explosive anger. It came with a mature, almost silent sadness. The realization that people close to me took advantage of a moment of vulnerability doesn't just provoke indignation. It provokes a type of mourning that's hard to explain. It's mourning for the image you had of your own family, for the idea of protection you believed was unconditional. At the shelter, no one tried to accelerate this process. I had time to think, to err, to go back on contradictory feelings. There were days I felt nostalgia, days I felt relief, days I felt both at the same time. This ambiguity confused me, but it also showed me I was still human, capable of feeling complex things without needing to choose just one version of the story. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. My speech became more direct, my decisions more conscious. I no longer accepted vague explanations or minimized discomforts. Not because I had become distrustful of everything, but because I learned that respect doesn't need to be begged for. It should exist from the beginning, or it doesn't truly exist. Contact with other elderly people reinforced this understanding. Each conversation revealed a variation of the same theme: gradual loss of autonomy, control disguised as help, silence imposed by fear of breaking ties. The individual details didn't matter. The underlying feeling was similar. This made me understand that what I lived through wasn't an exception, but part of something bigger and little discussed. I also had to face my own resistance in recognizing the violence. For a long time, I associated this term with something visible, immediate, undeniable. It took me a while to accept that violence can also be slow, polite, and apparently rational. It doesn't need to raise its voice when it manages to convince, and I was convinced that questioning was a sign of ingratitude. This realization was uncomfortable, but liberating. By understanding how I was silenced, I stopped blaming myself for not having reacted earlier. Reacting requires clarity, and clarity doesn't exist where there's emotional manipulation. What happened to me wasn't the result of weakness, but of a dangerous combination between physical dependence and emotional trust. Gradually, I began to rebuild a fairer notion of who I am. Not just someone who aged and got sick, but someone who lived, worked, built relationships, and now needed support without losing their own dignity. This reconstruction didn't erase the marks of what I lived through, but prevented them from defining my value. There were moments when I thought about the future with apprehension, not from fear of staying there, but from fear of repeating patterns. I didn't want to confuse care with control again. I didn't want to hand over important decisions out of emotional exhaustion. This fear made me more attentive, more conscious of my choices, even in small things. I also realized that autonomy doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means participating in decisions that concern your life. At the shelter, I had help, but I also had a voice. This difference completely changed my perception of what it means to age with dignity. Physical dependence doesn't need to come accompanied by emotional submission. Over time, I came to accept that some wounds don't close completely. They leave scars that hurt on specific days, memories that arise without warning. But these scars also function as alerts. They remind me of what I can no longer ignore, of what I shouldn't normalize again. Today, when I look back, I don't see just a man who was exploited. I see someone who went through a difficult phase and managed to interrupt a cycle before it consumed him completely. This doesn't make me an ideal example or someone free of flaws, just someone more conscious, more attentive, more whole than I was before. I still carry questions without answers. There are still silences that hurt, but I no longer carry the confusion that made me believe the problem was me. This internal change is silent, but powerful. It doesn't make noise, doesn't demand applause, but sustains each decision I make now. What I live through cannot be erased, but it can be understood, and understanding is the first step to not repeating. My story doesn't end here, but it also doesn't conclude in suffering. It continues at a different pace, more careful, more attentive to the signs I previously ignored. By recovering my consciousness, I also recovered something essential, the right to exist without fear within my own relationships. This isn't little. For someone who spent so much time feeling like a burden, this is everything. After everything I lived through, I realized that some stories don't need a grandiose ending to be true. Mine doesn't end with forced reconciliation or exemplary punishments. It ends with something more silent, but perhaps rarer: consciousness. The consciousness that aging shouldn't mean losing the right to decide, to trust, or to be treated with respect. This perception didn't come early, but it came in time. Today, when I observe my own trajectory, I understand how easy it is to cross the line between help and control without noticing, especially when the body weakens and the mind is tired. Dependence creates fertile ground for abuses that don't shout, don't leave visible marks, but settle in slowly, eroding autonomy. That's exactly how it was with me. Nothing happened all at once. Everything happened gradually. The most dangerous thing about this type of violence is that it disguises itself as care. It comes accompanied by soft phrases, reasonable justifications, promises of protection. And when you realize it, you no longer have access to your own choices. You no longer decide about your money, your time, your priorities. You no longer trust even your own feelings. It took me a long time to understand this, because no one taught me that violence can also be polite. If there's something I would like whoever is watching to take away, it's this: constantly feeling bad, guilty, or diminished isn't normal. Age doesn't matter. The situation doesn't matter. These feelings don't arise from nowhere. They're signs, and signs shouldn't be ignored, especially when they come accompanied by isolation, fear of speaking, or loss of control over your own life. Maybe you're not personally living through this, but you know someone who is. A father, a mother, a grandfather, a grandmother, an older neighbor. People of this age don't always manage to name what they're living through. Often they just feel something is wrong, but believe that complaining would be exaggeration, ingratitude, or weakness. That's how it was with me for a long time. The truth is that no one wakes up one day and decides to accept abuse. This happens when the person is tired, weakened, dependent, and emotionally tied to those who should protect them. That's why expecting the elderly person to react alone is unfair. Support almost always needs to come from outside, from someone who observes, asks, listens without judging. My story could have ended differently. If no one had noticed, if I had continued believing this was normal, maybe I would have lost much more than I lost. Maybe I would have completely lost the notion of who I was. Interrupting this cycle wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and that's why telling this story matters. Stories like this aren't exceptions. They happen every day in common homes with seemingly normal families. They don't always appear in the news because they aren't loud, but they leave deep marks. And as long as they remain in silence, they'll continue to repeat themselves. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. So I make a simple and human request. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, not for numbers, but because each subscription helps these stories reach more people who need to hear this before it's too late. In the comments, if you want, say where you're watching from, or if this story reminded you of someone. Often, sharing is the first step to breaking the silence. And you never know who might feel less alone reading what you wrote. At the end of this video, I'll leave recommended another real account as powerful as this one, about an elderly person who also took time to realize he was being exploited by those who claimed to care for him. It's a different story, but with very similar feelings. It's worth watching until the end. And now, the most important part. If you or someone you know is living through a situation of abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation, seek help. Even if you don't have absolute certainty, even if it seems confusing, there are channels created exactly for this. In the United States, you can call the Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116 for guidance and support for elderly people at risk. For cases of fraud or financial abuse against the elderly, there's the National Elder Fraud Hotline at 1-833-372-8311. In emergency situations or immediate risk, call 911.